Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Let us pray. Faithful God, may my words be your words. And may the meditations of all our hearts be guided by you. O God, our help in ages past, present, and future. Amen. For many years now, since I was in elementary school, one of my mom's favorite hobbies has been working on genealogy. She has spent over 20 years on reconstructing both sides of my family tree. I can remember many weeknights and weekend afternoons at the Worcester Library, back when it was in the old building, if anyone is familiar with that part of the world, in this dark, dungeony sort of room, as she would pore over these books of records and flip through microfiche. Anyone remember microfiche? And I always thought it was cool the way it would just flip, and she just pressed the button and these things would zoom by. That was amazing to my 10-year-old self. And she spent so many hours, and of course I and my brother would be dragged along, and we would have to find something else to do because we didn't really know or understand why she found this so fascinating. So we would go off to some other part of the library looking at our own books or for videos or different things. And I can remember occasional trips to cemeteries, good family fun, going to cemeteries to look at different graves. And every once in a while, there would be very rare occasions when we would visit someone's house who was a complete stranger to me, but who apparently was some long relative, somehow 3 million times removed, that she was able to get more information from. And of course I didn't understand this for the longest time. But after a while I would pick up on why this was important as she would begin to tell stories. Different little snippets of history that she was able to unearth and to share with us about where our family has been, where the generations that were before us came from, what might have happened to them in their lives, and how that might have somehow shaped who we are now. One ancestor that I've taken particular interest in recent years is my great-great-grandfather, Albus Gustav Nelson, who came here from Sweden in the late 1800s. And he was part of what was then called the Swedish Mission Friends. And he ended up pastoring and planting churches as part of that movement through New England, through Pennsylvania, through onto the Chicago area. He was all over the place, being a part of establishing this church movement in this country that is nowadays known as the Evangelical Covenant Church. And they're still around here and there. And to hear all of this, to hear some of this background and how the Nelsons in particular started in this part of the world, of course, all I could think was, well, obviously the apple didn't fall very far. Coming from many generations of pastors over the years. This is what makes the difference. When you hear stories like that about the generations that came before us, where and from whom we have generated from, and how that somehow has influenced who we are and who we continue to be. The author and theologian Diana Butler Bass makes some observations about the importance of genealogy. And she starts with an example. She starts with the examples of the genealogies of Jesus that we have in Matthew and Luke, which at first glance are just a big bunch of names, a huge list of names that I like to threaten those who volunteer as liturgists. Guess what? I'm going to stick you with this week. I never do that for those who want to volunteer. Yet. But again, on the surface, it just seems like a list of names. And then you look more closely. And you see who Matthew and Luke have included in this list. And then you go back and you read the stories that we have about them, and it might end up being surprising. This person was influential in who Jesus eventually came to be. This person, there are some crazy stories in the Old Testament about some of these people, and yet they are included in Jesus' background. And she makes this observation as part of what it means to look back on the generations that came before us and to allow ourselves to be surprised and to allow ourselves to be informed by those generations that preceded us, and consider how they impact our own identity. And then she makes one other observation. She makes the observation that when we trace our family trees back far enough, they start to get really big. Those branches get wider and wider and wider. They spread out further and further and further until we realize that ultimately we are all connected. That we are all somehow connected. If we trace our family trees back far enough, there are these connections among us. We are interlocked somehow, and these trees end up forming, these family trees end up forming a great canopy over us. That we continue to be covered by and watched over by. We don't hear too often from the book of Revelation around here. Other traditions spend much more time with it than we do, that we tend to. And the reason that not a lot of people may like spending a lot of time in Revelation is because it just seems so strange. There is a lot of symbolism and imagery that is hard to wrap our minds around. And maybe some of us would prefer, maybe some of us are glad that it's shoved in the back of the Bible. Back there, then we don't have to deal with it very often. Well, the book of Revelation, shun, singular, shun, not shuns, first of all, is written by John of Patmos, thought to be one of the original apostles. And he has been exiled to an island. And so he is writing this letter. It is a letter of encouragement to 7 churches. Churches who are experiencing persecution and suffering and hardship and pain and uncertainty about their future. And John is writing to say, you need to hang in there. Hold fast. Keep the faith. Because God is watching over you. God is still with you. God is still empowering you and will give you comfort and strength to continue on in the good fight. And so near the end, as after he has presented all of this symbolism and all of this imagery to help make his point, that he settles on this vision. He shares this vision of a new heaven and a new earth. First, the old things pass away. The first things, the old heaven and earth, they first pass away. Many like to talk about Revelation as being about the end of the world. And here in this passage, there is an end, sort of. There is an end of something. The first things. But then comes something new. It is the end of one thing, but it is the beginning of something else. And in this new beginning, we are told, there is no more mourning, or weeping, or grief. Those things have passed away. And instead, something new and brilliant and beautiful and peaceful and life-giving has taken its place. And John shares this image saying, ultimately, God has this. God is still watching over you, and God will have the last word. Where all these old things of suffering and mourning will eventually pass away, and something wonderful and new will take its place. And at the very end of this vision, God makes a declaration. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end. God was there in the beginning. God will be there in the end. All things that generated and have generated and continue to generate from God will ultimately generate back to God. All things are within God, and God will ultimately bring everything back to God. God has this, John says, where the first things will eventually generate back to God, and something new will form for all of us to experience and enjoy. This sort of message seems particularly formative and appropriate for a day like today. A day where we gather to celebrate the saints that have gone before us. Where we take time to remember those who are now a part of that great big canopy that continues to provide us cover and shade, continuing to watch over us, continuing to surround us. At other times we call this the great cloud of witnesses. These who have been saints to us, who are continually still a part of us, who have helped shape and form who we are, from whom we have generated. And so we take time to give thanks for them, and we also take time to remember that ultimately all of us generate back to the one who first formed us. In God, all things begin and end and begin again.